Welcome to Random Flyer, the podcast that brings you the true stories of New Zealand's aviation pioneers, the machines they flew, and the decisions that shape the skies we fly through today. This video is part of a series exploring the early development of airlines in New Zealand, from the introduction of the Transport Licensing Commercial Aircraft Services Act in 1934, through to the outbreak of war in late 1939. The series covers the inauguration and growth of the main trunk operator, Union Airways, along with the feeder services Air Travel New Zealand Limited, Cook Strait Airways and East Coast Airways, as well as unsuccessful competitor New Zealand Airways. There are 5 videos in total, so check back from time to time to check out the rest of the series. Today, we take a deep dive into the fascinating history of Union Airways, from its early days under the Union Steamship Company to its role in establishing New Zealand's air networks. Union Airways played a pivotal part in shaping the country's commercial aviation landscape. In the years following the Great Depression, New Zealand was looking to develop its air services to meet the growing demand for faster transportation. The country's transport system was heavily reliant on rail, but air travel was quickly gaining traction. The Transport Coordination Board, responsible for overseeing commercial air routes in the country, was under pressure to evaluate and grant licenses for the emerging airline operators, particularly one to operate the main trunk of the new network of airlines. Applicants for this trunk service were Union Steamship Company on behalf of Union Airways New Zealand Limited, the now amalgamated New Zealand Airlines Limited of New Plymouth, Dominion Airways Limited of Auckland, and New Zealand Airways Limited, to be based in Dunedin. Union Airways applied for a license to operate a trunk air service connecting Palmerston North to Dunedin via Christchurch. The initial proposal was seen as somewhat limited in scope, but Union said that wasn't stopping there, they had bigger plans. The company's strategy was to extend the service to Auckland and Invercargill within a year, once he'd gained enough experience on their primary route. It was a vision of connecting New Zealand's major cities through air, laying the groundwork for the nation's air infrastructure. At the same time, the Transport Coordination Board was in the midst of reviewing competing applications from other airlines such as Great Pacific Airways and the aforementioned New Zealand Airways. By April 11, 1935, the board had granted licenses to both Union Airways and Great Pacific Airways, but not without some reservations. They highlighted the limitations of Rongotai Aerodrome in Wellington, which was not deemed to be safe due to its poor weather conditions and surface for the larger planes that Union Airways had proposed to use. Avoiding Wellington, Union Airways applied to operate a trunk service between Palmerston North, Christchurch and Dunedin. Fast forward to May 3, 1935, and Union Airways was officially incorporated as a company, with £50,000 in paid-up capital. The company now had a solid financial foundation to purchase planes and begin operations, with the Union Steamship Company subscribing 60% of the shares. The purchase of 3 de Havilland DH-86 Express airliners in May 1935 marked the beginning of the Union Airways fleet. These 4-engine biplanes were capable of carrying 10 to 14 passengers. Although they were predominantly wood and canvas type planes, they were state-of-the-art for their time. Designed for both mail and passenger service, they would fly between Palmerston North, Blenheim, Christchurch and Dunedin. The Express first flew on Sunday the 14th of January 1934 and was designed to meet the requirements of Qantas, who initially rejected the design because of its single pilot configuration, which they believed would lead to pilot fatigue on the longer routes. In addition to the planes, Union Airways had to develop the infrastructure to support its growing operations. The company relied on the Christchurch Gas Company to supply a key ingredient for aviation fuel, benzol, a coal tar derivative, which was used in the high-compression engines of the DH-86. This contract highlighted the growing network of resources needed to keep New Zealand's aviation sector running smoothly. At the time, the Christchurch Gas Company manufactured 2,000 to 3,000 gallons of benzol yearly, and was the only company in the country making benzol on a commercial scale. By comparison, a wide-body airliner flying from Auckland to LA these days will take off with 30,000 US gallons of jet fuel on board. The first de Havilland planes arrived on the Waipawa on Sunday 17 November 1935, and were taken to Wigram Aerodrome for assembly and testing. They were the largest, heaviest and most powerful aeroplanes that had ever flown in the country. They attained a speed of 170 miles an hour, which was a New Zealand record for the time, and it was the first large modern machine to be incorporated into commercial service. Kororo was the first to be assembled at Wigram Aerodrome and took to the air late in the afternoon of Monday, 9 December 1935. Early in the afternoon of that day, the machine was towed out of its new hangar and loaded up with lead ingots, used as dummy weights to simulate a passenger load. The tanks were fueled from special electric fueling plant installed by the company, and the engines were started using electrical ground power. The plane took off, performed several landings and takeoffs before its final landing, and was wheeled back into the hangar. On Wednesday, 15 January 1936, 5 weeks after being landed in Christchurch, and with the test flights having been completed, Union Airways express airliners the Kororo and Kotuku were officially put into service, flying southbound and northbound between Palmerston North and Dunedin. To put this into perspective, Air Travel New Zealand Limited had been in operation up and down South Westland for just over a year, East Coast Airways for 9 months, and Cook Strait Airways had been operating for just over a fortnight. The timetable for Union Airways was for the southbound plane to depart Palmerston North at 8:30 a.m, with stops in Blenheim at 9:30 a.m, Christchurch at 11, and arriving in Dunedin at 20 to 12. Northbound, the plane would depart Dunedin at 11:30 a.m, stopping at Christchurch at 10 past 1, Blenheim at 2:30, and arriving at Palmerston North at 20 to 4. But the road to success wasn't always smooth. Less than a month after beginning operations, the fledgling new airline was hit by the February gale of 1936. The full force of the storm was felt in the Manawatu, home to the Union Airways base, on Sunday, 2nd of February. Power lines were downed across the district, with some of the poles blocking the main road south to Wellington, and a man was blown off his roof and killed in Palmerston North. The Manawatu River reached 15 feet 9 inches. And in Wellington, the inter-island ferry, TEV Rangatira, also owned by the Union Steamship Company, struck a rock off the Wellington Heads just after 6 a.m. and was badly holed, forcing it to enter the harbour in reverse. Bathing sheds and a shower room at Te Aro Bars, roughly the site of the current Freiburg Pool, were carried away by the gale shortly after 9:30 in the morning and were recovered up against the Taranaki Street wharf. Up in the sky, the Union Airways machine Koromiko had left Dunedin at 11:30 a.m, with 3 passengers, but was unable to proceed past Christchurch because of the wind, and had to return to Dunedin. The second machine did not leave the ground that morning and remained pegged down at Milson Aerodrome in Palmerston North, with the third express, escaping the storm, tucked up inside the company's hangar there. The first airmail services were introduced on March 16, 1936, linking cities across the country. Proposal for a special airmail rate of 2 pennies per ounce helped ensure the economic viability of Union Airways operations. However, there was always a tension between the needs of passengers and the needs of airmail, the basic problem being that passengers generally wanted to leave first thing in the morning and get a full day in, while letter writers tend to write their letters during the day and would prefer the postal cut-off to be as late as possible. This problem becomes multi-dimensional when it comes to eventually integrating the routes of the other companies like East Coast Airways and Cook Strait Airways into the Union Airways main trunk service. Consequently, 27 April 1936 saw the tensions between airmail and passenger service rear its head. Changes to the timetables meant that the northbound service from Dunedin, which had been scheduled to meet the overnight mail from Invercargill and used to depart at 11:30 a.m, was set back to 8:15 a.m, getting into Palmerston North at 12:35. This was done to allow the northbound plane to connect with the Cook Strait services in Blenheim at 11:30. But it also meant that the previous evening's Invercargill mail, that usually had time to make the 11:30 departure from Dunedin, would now not have time to catch the northbound plane. This change caused considerable upset amongst the business class of Christchurch as well, because while previously it had been possible to post a letter by noon for delivery to the business centre in Auckland the following morning, it would now need to be posted by 9 a.m. So, while the new timetable opened up more convenience for passengers, it also rendered airmail pointless, because the sender would have to have posted the letter by 9 a.m, or else it would have to go the next day, making it no quicker than conventional mail services. The first major expansion of the network was planned for mid-June 1937, with the airline planning to open a new 2-way daily service between Auckland and Wellington, finally allowing Auckland to connect with the airline networks. This journey would be completed in under 3 hours, including stops in New Plymouth and Palmerston North, which was a marked improvement on the 12 hours required for the express train. Up until this point, Union Airways had been flying de Havilland DH-86 express planes between Palmerston North and Dunedin, with a plane leaving Palmerston North at 8:30 and one leaving Dunedin at 8:15 a.m. Now the airline was to inaugurate a service between Auckland and Wellington, this time using the new American Lockheed aircraft. The Lockheed Electra was a step up for New Zealand Airlines, being the first all-metal airliner used in the country. While the previous airliners had been made of wood and fabric, the Lockheed Model 10 Electra had a stressed skin, aluminium alloy, monocoque fuselage, with only one set of wings, and was powered by two Pratt & Whitney radial engines, producing 340 kilowatts, as opposed to the four 150 kilowatts de Havilland Gypsy 6 engines of the de Havilland airplanes. While it was not very much heavier than the older de Havilland Express planes, it did cruise substantially faster due to its streamlined construction. Sanction was given for the new planes on 3rd of December 1936 by Minister of Transport, the Honourable Semple, and the orders were placed straight away with Lockheed for 3 of them. The first of the Electras was landed in Auckland on Thursday 28th of May 1937. Because of their size, the fuselage and wings had to be dismantled before shipping, and were carried as deck cargo, while the engines were carried in cases in the hold. On arrival, the machines were slung onto waiting barges and towed to the RNZAF base at Hobsonville for assembly. Unfortunately, their timing was poor, and the planes had to wait until well into the evening for a favourable tide, at which point they were floated into the airbase under floodlight. Planes were then flown to Mangere Aerodrome in South Auckland, where the airline had established a new technical and terminal facilities, and testing was carried out there. The new service was inaugurated a month later on 27 June 1937, and thus, after 18 months of operation, Auckland was finally part of the air network. The route would be flown daily in both directions by 2 of the 3 machines, with the third held in reserve. The timetable was that the southbound Electra would leave Auckland at midday, pass through New Plymouth at 1:15 p.m, Palmerston North at 2:15, and arrive in Wellington at 3 p.m, while the northbound plane would leave Wellington at midday, pass Palmerston North at 12:45, New Plymouth at 1:45, and arrive in Auckland at 3. But why the Electra? In 1937, New Zealand was still firmly attached by the apron strings to England, so the purchase of the American Lockheed was a substantial departure from form. Also, the British de Havilland Express had only been in production for a couple of years at that point, and, despite the speed advantage of the Electra, the carrying capacity was about the same as the Express. It was claimed that the agencies involved in the UK were not able to spare the material because of the build-up to the war, and the Americans were not as engaged in that sort of production. But there were other problems with the British-produced aircraft, particularly the de Havilland 86 Express itself. Seriously lacking in directional stability, the de Havilland Express aircraft type was frequently in trouble overseas. In October 1934, Hollyman Airways VHURN Miss Hobart was lost in the Bass Strait with no survivors. And the following year, in October 1935, a second Hollyman's Airways Express, VHURT Luina, was lost in the Bass Strait, again with no survivors. It was thought possible that a small fire from a dropped cigarette had led to someone running aft suddenly to stamp it out, a sudden change in weight distribution that could lead to a fatal loss of control. On 13th of December 1935, a third Hollyman DH-86, Lapina, force-landed on Hunter Island, off northern Tasmania, with the lower part of the port interplane strut having vibrated loose. An investigation by the Australian Civil Aviation Board using stop-motion film of the wing in flight resulted in identification of wing distortion and failure under certain flight conditions. Following these fatal Australian Express accidents and the forced landing of VHUSW Lapina on 13 December 1935, the Australian government suspended the type certificate of airworthiness. This caused outrage in Britain as it reflected on the whole British aircraft industry. In reality, the de Havilland Express had approached the limits to which traditional plywood and canvas construction could be taken, and was obsolete compared with the all-aluminium, stress-skinned aircraft. The Royal Air Force's Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment tested the DH-86 design in 1936, following 3 fatal crashes in Europe. The results of the test were so bad that they were not released to the public for 40 years. It was said in the report that the de Havilland 86 had been rushed from design concept to test flight in an astonishing 4 months in order to meet the deadline set by the Australian ML contracts, and a lot of attention to detail had been ignored. There was poor response from control movements at certain speeds, and the wings were inclined to twist badly if ailerons were used coarsely, and, most seriously, the vertical tail was too small. The result was an aircraft that, although quite safe under normal conditions, could rapidly get out of control. So the new service went ahead with the American planes, but this was despite inadequate facilities on the Mangere to Wellington run. Complaints were made by the pilots about the state of Mangere Aerodrome. Having been started as the grounds for the Auckland Aero Club, it was considered ideal for that kind of flying, but it was totally inadequate as a commercial airport. The surface was the worst on the network, and while it was not dangerous, it did risk damage to the machines. Drainage was unsatisfactory, and the slipperiness of the surface rendered wheel brakes useless. The only suitable runway being oriented to the prevailing winds meant that when the wind blows from an unusual direction, use must be made of taxiways in areas of the aerodrome that were being described as under construction. Wellington was just as bad. As New Zealand's aviation infrastructure grew, Union Airways kept up with the increasing demand. Their fleet now included 3 Lockheed Electras and 3 de Havilland DH-86 Express, and the airline was gearing up for future expansion. The company's ability to maintain regular service even during challenging times, including weather disruption and equipment issues, helped solidify their role as New Zealand's primary air carrier. The airline expanded again in October 1937, commencing on Friday the 29th. A second daily return Electra flight was added to the Auckland to Wellington run, this one departing in the morning, while the schedule of the afternoon flight was altered to become more direct and would skip New Plymouth, heading straight to Palmerston North. They also altered the southbound timetable for the Palmerston North to Dunedin route to allow passengers from Auckland to connect at Palmerston North. This combination would allow passengers to leave Auckland at 8:15 am, reach Palmerston North at 10:25 to catch the southbound to Havilland flight, and reach Dunedin by 3 pm, having passed through Blenheim and Christchurch. Northbound, the first plane would depart Wellington at midday, calling only at Palmerston North, while the second machine would leave Wellington at 3 pm and arrive in Auckland at 6 pm, having stopped at Palmerston North and New Plymouth. To allow better connections to Napier and Gisborne, changes were also made to the East Coast Airways route and timetable. East Coast Airways has started flying between Gisborne and Napier on 15 April 1935, with the remainder of the journey south to Wellington, or once operational, the Union Airways hub in Palmerston North, being completed by rail. On October 30th, they extended their de Havilland Dragon service to Palmerston North to connect with the rest of the network, allowing folks to fly across the country. So, for instance, if you wanted to fly from Auckland to Gisborne, you'd leave Auckland at 8:15 am and arrive in Palmerston North at 10:35 and transfer to the East Coast Airways flight to Napier and Gisborne at 1 pm. If you were in Gisborne and wanted to fly to Dunedin, you would leave Gisborne at 6:40 am, arrive in Palmerston North at 9 am, in time for the 10:30 am de Havilland Express service to Blenheim, Christchurch and Dunedin at 10:30 am. It was a very complicated balancing act between the needs of airmail, passengers, and coordinating with other airlines to provide these connections. But while this was going on, Union Airways were becoming involved in the new Trans-Tasman Air Service project, eventually named TEAL, which was a joint effort between New Zealand, Australia, through Qantas, and England through British long-range commercial airline Imperial Airways. Union had been appointed the booking agent for Imperial Airways in 1937, and it was becoming clear that Union were also the obvious agency to represent the government over the start of the Tasman Empire Airways service. The first physical manifestation of that project came into view over the New Year's break of 1937, with the Imperial Airways flying boat Senatoris arriving in Auckland in 1937. Pam Ann had arrived to flying boat a few days earlier on 29th of December 1937. It's impossible to understand how impressive these planes were to the people who saw them. They were the largest, fastest and heaviest fly machines ever seen in New Zealand. The de Havilland only took to the sky here at the beginning of the previous year, but now there was this monster-sized airplane touching down on Auckland's Waitemata Harbour, twice the length and 4 times the maximum gross weight of the Express, and it had flown itself all the way from Britain. Closer to home, however, a trial service connecting Whanganui with the trunk system at Palmerston North was initiated on 10 January 1938, using an East Coast Airways Dragon. This would leave Whanganui at midday and arrive at Palmerston North at 12:30 to connect to the main trunk, while passengers travelling to Whanganui from other points would join the plane there in Palmerston North at 10:45 and arrive in Whanganui at 11:15. But the service was not very well patronised and was terminated after 3 months. Not every flight went smoothly. On Monday, 10th of May 1938, the Lockheed Electra Kotarori one of the three operated by Union Airways, suffered a tragic accident shortly after takeoff from Mangere Aerodrome, causing the deaths of the pilot and the co-pilot. The aeroplane was on a scheduled run from Auckland to Palmerston North. It took off towards the southwest on a grass runway and suffered a failure of the right-hand engine shortly after takeoff. The plane continued to climb, but curved around to the right and ended up hitting a line of trees north of the field along Nixon Road, about 40 feet above the ground, tearing off a wing and exploding in a ball of fire onto the ground. Both pilots were killed in the crash, and while it was a scheduled flight, there were no passengers on board. An inquiry placed the blame for the crash on the pilots, in lieu of any evidence from the engines, which had been destroyed in the crash and subsequent fire. They also commented on the poor record-keeping of the engineering section of the airline. One engineering worker appears to have doctored some of the records, with the date May 10 being written over a 9 in the safety certificate and test sheet, and another engineering staff member seemingly confused about the day on which the engine had been overhauled. It was a reminder of the risks of early aviation and the challenges faced by operators ensuring passenger safety. 4 days after the accident, Union Airways ordered a pair of Lockheed Electras, one to replace the crashed Qatari and an additional Electra to take care of the anticipated increase in passenger traffic next season. By mid-1938, it was reported that the airline was carrying around 1,000 trips a year, carrying 8,863 passengers, with a reliability of 99.16%. That year, there was also the curious case of Captain Blythe, the chief pilot of Union Airways, who had departed hastily for England on 9 June 1938. He was arrested on board the Doric Star in Auckland a short time before its departure. 4 firms in Palmerston North had filed proceedings against him on a judgment summons and claims to recover debts of £299, 1 shilling 9 pence. On the judgment summons, Blythe was ordered to pay £47, 9 shilling 4 pence forthwith in lieu of 7 days in prison. Judgment by confession of £252, 17 shillings and 8 pence, with costs totalling £22, 14 shillings 6 pence, were given against the defendant under the other claims. The next big expansion for the airline came with the arrival and entry into service of the 2 new Lockheed Electras. On Thursday, 22nd of October 1938, the airline extended the Auckland to Wellington Electra air service south to Dunedin to provide a daily main trunk service between Dunedin and Auckland, replacing the old de Havilland Express route that only went as far north as Palmerston North. As from that Saturday onwards, the usual 8 a.m. Auckland to Wellington Electra would fly on its schedule as far south as Wellington, arriving at 11 a.m. However, instead of returning to Auckland at noon, the plane would carry on southwards for Christchurch and Dunedin. The Electra that had been doing the Wellington to Auckland run would now leave Dunedin at 8:15 a.m. and fly all the way to Auckland, stopping in Christchurch, Wellington, Palmerston North and New Plymouth. The expansion was timed to coincide with the arrival of the second order of Electras, and in preparation for this, on Monday 22nd of August 1938, 2 new machines were landed in Wellington this time, to be assembled by Union Airways ground staff under the supervision of the company's chief engineer at Rongotai Aerodrome in Wellington. When landed at Wellington, instead of being floated up the harbour like in Auckland, the tail of each aircraft was lashed to the back of a motor lorry, and the fuselage was towed to the aerodrome on its own wheels for assembly and testing. They were also winding back the de Havilland Express flights. From that date, they will be withdrawn entirely from the main trunk line, relegated to a new route between Gisborne and Christchurch, taking over and extending the route that had been previously flown by East Coast Airways de Havilland Dragons. The plane would leave Gisborne at 7 a.m. for Christchurch via Napier, Palmerston North and Blenheim, and make the return journey in the afternoon. Union Airways had taken a controlling interest in East Coast Airways, and earlier in the year, on 30th of June 1938, the company had ceased to exist as an independent operator. The de Havilland Express would also be deployed on a new route between Auckland and Gisborne from March 1939, the airline's last expansion before the war. The route was flown 3 times a week, leaving Auckland for Gisborne on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Then it would stay the night and make the return journey on Tuesday, Thursdays and Saturdays. What was previously a full day's journey from Auckland to Gisborne would now be covered in 2.5 hours with 10-minute stops in Tauranga and Apotiki. The service was a vision to eventually connect with Napier over summer 1940, so passengers in Napier could travel through to Auckland, but to start with, the planes would simply leave for Gisborne at 7:30 a.m. The second later flight that connected with Napier would never come to pass. As tensions rose internationally, New Zealand's aviation sector was not immune to the pressures of global conflict. On 5 October 1939, with World War II now underway, the New Zealand government took control of the civil air fleet, which included the airlines. It was announced that the government would take over all aircraft owned by Union Airways and Cook Strait Airways beginning 15 October 1939, except for the Union Airways Lockheed Electras. The transition was completed a month later, with the de Havilland Express, Dragons and Dragon Rapides all being taken over and used for training purposes by the Royal New Zealand Air Force. This meant that the machines used on the Gisborne run from Auckland would cease, with the last flight out from Auckland being made on Friday 13 October 1939. The Gisborne to Christchurch run was also cancelled. The Auckland to Wellington service would be amended from Saturday 14 October 1939, with the daily noon trip from Auckland and the 8:40am flight from Wellington being suspended. The 8am departure from Auckland and the midday departure from Wellington would remain unaffected. Electra service through to Dunedin would remain in place, and the Cook Strait Airways services, previously run by de Havilland Dragon Rapides, would be covered by the Union Airways Lockheed Electras. On the international front, one of the 3 new flying boats ordered for Teal were retained by Britain for their defence purposes. From December 1939, services were curtailed further. The daily service between Auckland and Dunedin would be confined to 3 times a week. The only service that was not affected by the outbreak of war was the West Coast run flown by Air Travel New Zealand. Yet even as the world ascended into war, the groundwork for future air services in New Zealand had been laid. By 1940, Union Airways had paved the way for the establishment of what would become the core of New Zealand's commercial air network. So what is the legacy of Union Airways? Well, it's more than just a company that connected cities through the air. It was the foundation of New Zealand's air transport industry. It was the main trunk operator, but also a significant financial backer of the 2 smaller feeder services. Thank you for flying with us today through the early days of Union Airways. We hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, and we'll be back with more tales from the skies in future episodes.